Welcome into Critical Thinking here on Mojo 50 Radio. Yes, it is I, your humble man with the most numbers here on Mojo 50 Radio, Andrew Coppins, coming to you live and direct this week. Boy, oh boy, do we have a great show. But before we get into that, do not forget, if you're listening via podcast, to hit that 5-star review, give us that rating, help us continue to grow. If you're listening live, you can always watch live as well on the Mojo 50 Radio Facebook page. You can find me on the socials at The Coppins Show. And if you're new, my last name is spelled Coppens, Coppens. As always, if you don't want to listen to the podcast, you can watch via my YouTube page, youtube.com/Andrew Coppins, youtube.com/Andrew Coppins. It will all be linked in the description. Hopefully you guys can find it, and hopefully you continue to subscribe. There will be my food for thought this coming week and all sorts of wonderful goodness there. Whatever is coming up on today's show, well, we're going to have our monthly chat with Illinois policy as we get all things local here in Chicago and the state of Illinois. A certain governor of ours came out with a budget, so we'll talk to Illinois policy about that budget and the numbers behind it. I kind of geeked out a little bit. We're also going to talk about bail reform being a thing here in Chicago, and guess what? The results say it's not necessarily as good as the judges that came up with it said it was going to be. Who wouldn't have seen that coming? I'm also going to explore what happens when a never-Trumper begins to twist themselves into too many pretzels to remember points from even 5 months ago. Thank you, David French, for that. But first, we've got Nevada, and it's caucusing today. Yes, the Democrats are caucusing in Nevada. We've got a humdinger of a debate that happened on Wednesday in that great state. We'll talk about that and more as we start the show with This Week in Socialism Sucks.
But you trigger people. Why do you think you do that? And how does it manifest?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of reasons. One, before people even knew who I was, like 5 minutes after I won my primary, it was the apocalypse on Fox News.
Yeah.
And
why?
I think it's because our political system is not designed for people like us. They're not designed for working people to succeed, for young people, for women, for people of color. It's not particularly welcoming. And historically, to have someone like that ascend, especially when I was running against someone who was the antithesis of those things.
Yeah. To ascend so rapidly.
Right.
Yeah.
It's upending. But also I think it's because our entire political system revolves, frankly, around rich men. And rich men are not the center of my universe. Working families are. And that is controversial.
Yeah. Well, you have that in common with Bernie Sanders.
Absolutely.
That's why you're on his team.
Yeah.
Well, says, Mayor Buttigieg, you'd like to weigh in?
Yes, we've got to wake up as a party. We could wake up 2 weeks from today, the day after Super Tuesday, and the only candidates left standing will be Bernie Sanders and Mike Bloomberg, the two most polarizing figures on this stage. And most Americans don't see where they fit if they've got to choose between a socialist who thinks that capitalism is the root of all evil and a billionaire who thinks that money ought to be the root of all power. Let's put forward somebody who actually lives and works in a middle-class neighborhood in an industrial Midwestern city. Let's put forward somebody who's actually a Democrat. Look, we shouldn't have to choose between one candidate who wants to burn this party down and another candidate who wants to buy this party out. Look, we can do better.
Senator Sanders, are you polarizing?
What Senator Sanders is proposing?
Absolutely not. I can't think of ways that would make it easier for Donald Trump to get reelected than listening to this conversation. It's ridiculous. We're not going to throw out capitalism. We tried that. Other countries tried that. It was called communism, and it just didn't work.
Senator Sanders, what did you mean that you don't think they should exist?
Tell you what I mean.
What did that mean?
We have a grotesque and immoral distribution of wealth and income. Mike Bloomberg owns more wealth than the bottom 125 million Americans. That's wrong. That's immoral. That should not be the case when we got 500,000 people sleeping out on the street, when we have kids who cannot afford to go to college, when we have 45 million people dealing with student debt. We have enormous problems facing this country, and we cannot continue seeing a situation where in the last 3 years, billionaires in this country saw an $850 billion increase in their wealth. Congratulations, Mr. Bloomberg. But the average American last year saw less than a 1% increase in his or her income. That's wrong.
Mayor Bloomberg, should you exist?
I can't speak for all billionaires. All I know is I've been very lucky, made a lot of money, and I'm giving it all away to make this country better. And a good chunk of it goes to the Democratic Party as well.
Is it too much? Have you earned too much money? Has it been an obscene amount of... Should you have earned that much money?
Yes, I worked very hard for it, and I'm giving it away.
Yes, folks, socialism sucks a ton, but you know what doesn't suck? American Pride Roasters and APR Coffee. Yes, American Pride Roasters is the official coffee of Mojo 50 Radio, but it's also a really, really good product. My wife enjoys it. I'm not the biggest coffee drinker in the family, but I will tell you the chocolate-covered strawberry coffee from this month, the promotion for Mojo 50 Radio, was amazing. Absolutely 100% amazing. It was quality. And folks, if you like your Folgers, they've got something similar to that. And if you like your coffee more exotic, more of the espresso variety, they've got you covered there as well. Do not forget the coffee drops. They're fantastic. The coffee drops, folks. I absolutely love those coffee drops. So it's really simple. Hit up AmericanPrideRoasters.com, AmericanPrideRoasters.com. From the mild to the exotic and all points in between, folks, they've got everything for you. APR Coffee, at APR Coffee on Twitter. I want to say they're on Instagram, but I don't know that for 100% for sure. Again, that is APR, American Pride Roasters, AmericanPrideRoasters.com, AmericanPrideRoasters.com. Check it out. All right, so we just had This Week in Socialism Sucks, and a lot of it was about this debate that happened. But is anybody else still smiling ear to ear after that Democratic debate? Because I am. That was glorious. You had everybody shanking everybody that wasn't named Joe Biden, because why would you shank the wounded animal? I mean, the guy was already not going to become president of the United States. What would be the point? But this was really light on actual substance. It was glorious from a theater perspective. So whatever does somebody interested in actual critical thinking take away from a debate like that? Well, I took away this. Bernie Sanders is an absolute con man, a horrible human being. Some would say an absolute prick. I am just so sick and tired of a few things when it comes to Bernie Sanders. So I want to lay these out for you. I am just sick of Sanders talking about the morality of his policy and the immorality of other individuals, while he has spent his entire adult life suckling off the teat of the American taxpayer, whether that is the people of Burlington, Vermont, whether that is the congressional district he once represented, and now the entire state, and thus the entire country. I am absolutely sick and tired of him talking about morality while being one of the most immoral people. I find it completely immoral to have spent your entire life not producing a single thing of value to society and taking money. That is what you're doing when you take that government salary. You are taking money from the American taxpayer. When you are a senator, when you are a congressperson, you get paid by us. You've made that your entire life. It's not like you were once a lawyer or once a doctor or once anything that would actually be productive in society. You want to talk about morality? and you've done that your entire adult life? I'm also so sick of this billionaires line, the immorality of billionaires, and billionaires are evil. Does anybody remember back to 2016 when that line was millionaires and billionaires? But now it can't possibly be millionaires and billionaires because capitalism for me but not for thee of Bernie Sanders is all in effect. He is a multi-millionaire. His wife is certainly a millionaire, and we're about to get into that. So he's got to ditch that millionaires part of his moral play to the American people. Now, personally, that line from Bloomberg in that debate about communism was amazing. The audible gasp from people like Elizabeth Warren, Joe Biden, I think Pete Buttigieg also gasped. Whoa, what do you mean you use the word communism? I hate to tell you, but Bernie Sanders is an actual communist. You could just listen to him on that stage. He wants to nationalize energy. He wants to nationalize almost everything, whether that's health care. We're not just talking about insurance. We're talking about wanting to nationalize hospitals. That is where Bernie Sanders wants to go. This man has not disavowed a single communist thought that he has ever had in his entire life. But of course, just like all communists, it is really capitalism for them and not for the rest of us. Now, I don't begrudge him earning $1 million or whatever he earned for the book deal that he had, because congratulations, you sort of kind of produced something. I'm guessing that was also ghostwritten. I'm just guessing on that because, well, Bernie Sanders doesn't seem to be able to put a cogent thought together of his own. But last year, he also earned over $500,000. Last time I checked, that is not your government salary. So congratulations. You are the very people you rail against. And then the last bit that I want to talk about here is Bernie Sanders' wife, Jane. Bernie Sanders rails against cronyism and crony capitalism and corruption in politics, right? But let's take a look at the adult life of Jane Sanders. She's managed to get cushy job after cushy job throughout Sanders' public life. When he became mayor of Burlington, Vermont, she became, oh, that's right, president of Burlington College, which she, mind you, ran right into the ground while taking a very, very nice salary in the mix. Now, if you ever heard of Old Town Media, LLC, chances are you probably haven't, unless you've been going into the weeds of Bernie Sanders' life. But Old Town Media, LLC happens to be a media ad buying company. Basically, think of it as a brokerage house for advertising for political candidates. Just so happens that Bernie Sanders' wife and two, not one, but two of her friends are the principal owners of Old Town Media. And who was the number one client of Old Town Media, LLC? Well, in 2016, it was Bernie freaking Sanders, to the tune of $82 million worth of ad buys going through Old Town Media. Now, the industry standard in this situation is about 15%. Again, 15% of 82 million. You can see how his wife is suddenly a multi-millionaire. Now, I can also see now how they can afford their home in Vermont, their home in Washington, D.C., and that camp. By the way, that's some like 50 acres or some ridiculous amount of acreage in Vermont with a massive house on it. Now you see how they can afford all of those things. Because it's capitalism for me, not for thee when it comes for Bernie Sanders. But I find it hilarious that they are being crony capitalists, nepotism, whatever you want to put the title on it, while railing against that throughout the entire 2016 and 2020 campaigns. Now, this was such a problem, this Old Town Media Group was such a problem in 2016 that staffers on Bernie Sanders' campaign were worried about this. Now, if a socialist staff member is worried about crony capitalism within your own organization, may I suggest, Bernie, you're doing it all sorts of wrong, and thus you, my friend, would be a hypocrite and a liar. Now, again, I don't begrudge Old Town Media or any organization making money, but I do begrudge the fact that Bernie Sanders is one of just 3 clients of Old Town Media, and that he represents almost 95% of all media ad buys, and that Jane Sanders' wife has been doing this type of cronyism and shakedown artistry since 2000. In fact, in 2000 and 2004, when people were running for the governorship of Vermont, magically Bernie Sanders held out his endorsement until people bought ads from Jane Sanders and another company that she was working for at the time. And then once they did that, magically Bernie Sanders said, oh, you know what? I think we should do that. I just find it absolutely grotesque that the man talks about corruption in politics, and yet he does this, and yet he's involved in the crony capitalism that he rails against. This man is a straight-up con man, a grifter, and anybody who takes this person seriously needs to have their head examined. So if you know a Bernie bro in your life, ask them what they think about Old Town Media making $82 million off of ad buys. Now, I also find it funny that Sanders is using the economics of Emmanuel Saez and Gabriel Zuckman, whose work has come under increased scrutiny for being false. False. And my final point on Sanders, let's just take his single-payer healthcare plan seriously for a moment. And let's say that he needs to enact higher taxes on everybody. Well, there's this meme that's been going around on the right that bugs me to no end about this, because we've got plenty of room to talk about this without being false. Yes, there is a false meme going around, and it goes something like this. Ever wonder why $15 an hour? Well, let's do a bit of math, okay? Bernie Sanders says at the debate that he wants a minimum wage to be $15 per hour, so $15 times 40 equals $600. You can see it on your screen right now. 600 times 52 is 31,200. Bernie Sanders wants free health care and was asked how he would pay for it. He says he's going to raise taxes to 52% on anybody making over $29,000 per year. 52% of 31,200 equals 16,224 in tax. 31,000, you have blah, blah, blah. You get down to $7.20 an hour. Math is fascinating. That's how the meme ends. Well, yes, math would be fascinating to say the least. It's just that none of this is true, because here's Bernie Sanders' income tax proposals from the Tax Foundation, which is not a left-wing site, but not really right-wing either. So it turns out that those people making under 10 grand would pay about 10%, just like they do now. Then up to 38,700, 12%, just like under Trump's tax plans. Do you already see the problem with this assumption of 52%? Because I sure do. Folks, you don't get to the 52% level until you're making over $10 million. $10 million from Bernie Sanders. Do you see the problem here? So, my request, if you see this meme, call it out, call the people out, and then make sure you don't spread it. Like I said before, Bernie Sanders' healthcare plan has plenty of room to be debunked. We don't need to use false math to do so. We don't need to be Bernie Sanders. We don't need to be most of the people that are up on that Democratic stage telling flat out lies all the time. The numbers are on our side when it comes to Medicare for all. We don't need to spread false numbers. Now, the other takeaway here for me is that Elizabeth Warren pulled a Chris Christie. She just shanked Michael Bloomberg while also tanking her own candidacy. Because if she's not going to, she damn well is not going to let Mike Bloomberg become president either. At the end of this debate, it became clear to me that Bernie Sanders is absolutely inevitable for the Democratic Party. Inevitable. And may God, whom Sanders doesn't actually believe in, even though he wants to tout his Jewish roots, may God have mercy on our souls if this man is elected. May I suggest that ditch Meet America if Bernie Sanders is elected. Now, I want to talk about morality a little bit more here. I know, not exactly the most critical thinking of topics, but from one hypocritical political candidate who likes to talk about morality, I want to switch to talking about the hypocrisy in the political punditry world and a man who likes to talk about morality in the civic space, only it doesn't apply all the time. What in the hell am I talking about? Well, when you cross Never Trumpism with Drag Queen Story Hour, you get David French, like I talked about up front, and a lesson in Hypocrisy 101. What the hell am I talking about, like I asked? Well, over the last 6 months, David French has managed to scold Christians for both daring to suggest that morality comes into play when drag queens expose themselves both figuratively and literally in some cases at public libraries, and then also go into the voting booth and vote for Donald Trump in 2016 and during the 2020 election cycle, because you can't be a Christian and oppose that and vote for Donald Trump, right? So let me just go back into the Wayback Machine to September of 2019 as French penned this piece for National Review, a conservative magazine. This piece was titled "Viewpoint Neutrality Protects Both Drag Queens and Millions of American Christians." In the piece, he basically argued that public spaces like those libraries where drag queen story hours are happening all over this country are to be viewpoint neutral, and that they should be open to both drag queens and the Christians to do their things. Forcing morality in the public square should not be a thing either, according to David French, because protecting that viewpoint neutrality also protects Christians and their right to use public spaces for meetings, worship, prayer, and Bible study, and all of that, right? Now, I would be okay with all of this because, as I like to say here on the show, more speech is the answer to bad speech, and yes, drag queen story hours bad speech. Make no bones about it. From the DQSH website, it's just what it sounds like. Drag queens reading stories to children in libraries and bookstores. DQSH captures the imagination and play of gender fluidity of childhood and gives kids glamorous, positive, and unabashedly queer role models. Now, I don't know about you, but how do you interpret that as anything other than this is political and moral to the people who advocate for DQSH? But we're not supposed to impose morality. There's just a problem because when you fast forward, guess what? 5 months later, David French is telling us in an article that he penned this week, how then should Christians vote? I'll spare you most of that moral preening done in the article, but I'm going to fast forward to what can only be a very interesting bit of irony or hypocrisy on French's part. That's because he quotes John Adams, yes, that John Adams of Founding Fathers fame, saying, quote, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." In his own words, French continues saying, in other words, virtue is indispensable to the proper functioning of the American nation, and without that virtue, America could become, in Adams' words, the most miserable habitation in the world. So, wait, in this case, in voting, in the voting booth, in punching that ballot, you're supposed to take your Christian morality and not vote for Donald Trump. But in every other aspect of your civic life, in every other aspect of the public square, how dare you make a moral judgment? How dare you apply morality? Equal space does not mean equal outcomes. You could easily do that. You could easily counter it with some Christian group coming in and talking about the immorality of homosexuality or giving whatever Bible study that they would like to give right after Drag Queen Story Hour. I just find it funny that David French happens to believe that morality is at play in the ballot box, but nowhere else in civic life. Either it is part of civic life, and that would include public spaces and the public square, or morality has no place at all. You cannot have your cake and eat it too. Well, I guess you could. You would be a hypocrite like David French. And folks, with that, we're going to hit a break right here on Mojo 50 Radio. On the flip side, Illinois Policy and myself have a conversation over the budget. And of course, we talk about bail bonds and, well, shocking new systems not working here in the city of Chicago. We'll be right back here on Mojo 50 Radio. Welcome back to Critical Thinking. Thank you for joining us for that second hour. Don't forget you can watch this live on the Mojo 50 Radio Facebook page. That's simple, facebook.com/Mojo50. And you can see this entire show in its entirety on my YouTube page at youtube.com/Andrew Coppins. You can follow me on the socials at The Coppins Show. All sorts of the wonderful goodness, whether that is Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Parlay. Take your pick. You'll be able to hopefully find me there and interact with the show using the hashtag Critical Thinking. But before we get into my talk with Illinois Policy, I got to remind you folks, if you're looking for custom apparel printing needs, Sublimation Printing is where it is at. And there's one place and one place only to really get that, and that is Sovereign Rising Printing. You can find them on Facebook, Sovereign Rising Custom Apparel, Sovereign Rising Custom Apparel for all your needs, whether that's hats, t-shirts, long sleeve t-shirts, hoodies, whether that's tumblers. Emily and her crew over at Sovereign Rising Printing do great work, and they are a very small business out of North Carolina. And really, this business came about because of some things happening with her son around school and his autism. And we'll let Emily talk about that next week as I have her on the show. But just make sure, if you want to support a quality printing business, if you got needs for your own business or for your personal needs, or like for me for this show, well, hit up Sovereign Rising Custom Apparel. Just search it on Facebook. I will have a link in the description in this video. If you're watching via Facebook, you can find it there. All sorts of wonderful goodness on that front. What's going on, everybody? Critical Thinking Special On-Site Edition. You see it in the background, Illinois Policy. It's that time of month on the show where we go local. And since I'm in Chicago and in the wonderful state of Illinois, I'm joined by Adam Schuster, Director of Budget and Tax Research here at Illinois Policy. Kind of a numbers guy, kind of a numbers geek. So thanks for joining me. Absolutely. I appreciate it. A big week in the state of Illinois here. We had J.B. Pritzker, our governor, give the budget address separate from the State of the State address that happened a little while ago. And as a numbers guy, what did you think?
Well, I mean, I kind of have two takes on the budget, which almost sound contradictory. On the one hand, it was like Groundhog Day because it's very much a status quo budget. It's a budget that the governor calls balanced, but if you look sort of beneath the hood and you actually dive deep into the numbers, it's clearly not a truly balanced budget. And on the other hand, it was kind of unique because it was the first time I think I've ever seen a governor use the budget address as an excuse to send a ransom note to taxpayers. And that's really what I think this was. He said, pass my tax hike, which voters have to approve on the ballot, or else I'm going to slash this range of core government services that includes education, public safety, things people actually want and need. And he's so far put structural spending reform kind of off to the side and said he's refusing to do it.
Yeah, and I thought that was my big takeaway was, wait. You're telling us if we don't do this, you're going to slash services? That doesn't make a lot of sense to me here when you take a look at it. But when I look at this from a perspective, maybe a 360 degree or way up there in the clouds perspective, how bad is this state really in terms of its shape fiscally and going forward, looking into the future? I mean, where is the future for this state? What is the future?
I mean, things are bad. There's no denying it. And I think that, any person, any politician who's trying to tell you that things are materially improving or trying to downsell the seriousness of the crisis either doesn't know what they're talking about or they're being dishonest. The last 10 years will go down in history in Illinois as a decade of public policy failure and economic decline. We saw some of the largest population loss in the nation. We have among the worst debt burdens in the nation. And the only strategy our politicians have had so far to try to get our way out of it is to increase taxes. And since we first started trying that strategy in 2011, the net debt of the state has quadrupled, and we've lost 157,000 people, which is equivalent to the population of Aurora. So clearly it's time for a new way of thinking. And, the progressive income tax would be nothing but, a variation on a failed strategy.
So I think one of the things that we need to look at here is not just the numbers, but we also have seen a lot of talk around corruption in the state here. And recently, I think there's been an article that's come out that indicates Mike Madigan, for those of you who are not in the state of Illinois, he is kind of the godfather of this state, if you will. We've heard a lot of talk about corruption. Did you see anything in this budget that deals with corruption at that level, or any indication that there's really any movement to take it seriously? We've seen Republican, we've seen Democrat administrations in this state talk about it. Nothing seems to change.
Well, I don't know that the budget address really touched on it, but I will say in the state of the state, the governor did talk about corruption and the seriousness of corruption. And he actually sort of dropped or indicated support for some ideas that we've supported at the Illinois Policy Institute. That includes banning lawmakers from also being lobbyists. This is something that you wouldn't even think someone would try to do. And so most states, it doesn't even have to be illegal because no one even thinks to do it. But in Illinois, we have elected state lawmakers registering as lobbyists and lobbying other governmental bodies, whether that's the executive branch, local governments. Another one is taking the muzzle off of our inspector general. Right now, the inspector general, cannot publish findings of wrongdoing without approval from the lawmakers.
That doesn't make a lot of sense.
It doesn't make a lot of sense. And so, there's some ideas like this, really ethics reforms that the governor has talked about and indicated some support for. Obviously, the proof will be in the action and what actually gets passed. And so we need to take it beyond words. But I think that there are at least, some signs that they're serious about starting to change the rules down there. And I think changing the rules is just the first step, because it really is a culture of corruption in Illinois. And, that's one reason why we shouldn't trust these people with greater taxing authority, with more tax revenues, is because they haven't proved that they're trustworthy so far.
Yeah, and I think that makes a lot of sense when you're looking at the grand scheme of things here. But I want to get into the actual budget. I know that there was a lot of talk about what we talked about up front with kind of the ransom stuff here, but I've also heard a lot of talk about a marriage penalty happening in this state. Now, as somebody who's been married for just a few years here, that seems to be counterintuitive to what every state should want to do. You want to encourage marriage. You want to encourage population growth. You want to encourage a healthy society. One of the ways would be to encourage marriage. Whether you believe the state should be involved in it or not, they are currently. So what is that all about?
Yeah, and you certainly don't want to disincentivize marriage. You don't want to discourage marriage through the tax code. And that's what Pritzker's progressive income tax would do. I mean, there are all kinds of just technical errors in the way they drafted their rate bill. Because the way this works is the governor passed the constitutional amendment to ask voters to change the Constitution to allow progressive taxation. And they also passed a rate proposal along with that lays out the specific rates. And the marriage penalty comes into play because the brackets, the levels of income at which rates take effect are different for single filers and married filers. But typically what you'll see states do is that the married filer, since it's two people, will be double the amount. So if a rate kicks in at $250,000 for an individual, it should kick in at $500,000 for a couple. This doesn't do that. And so it actually means that a couple married filing jointly would pay a higher effective tax rate than if those two people were filing separately and not married.
Wow, that's crazy. That's absolutely crazy in a state that's already losing population and the things that are going on here. But one of the other aspects of this is you can't just talk about it. You've got to be about it. And that's what you guys do here at Illinois Policy. So when you look at a budget, when you look at how we move forward out of the insanity that has happened in the past decade, you guys have a plan that's out there. Mm-hmm. What are the three main components and how do you see a way forward for the state?
Yeah, so that's exactly what our plan is called, Illinois Forward.
What do you know, folks?
And it's a plan that describes how our next decade can be better than our last. Because again, from 2010 to today, the aftermath of the Great Recession, Illinois politicians have failed. Tax hikes have failed. Our debt burdens have continued to grow. Our economy continues to lag the national average. And a lot of that has to do with, the crisis that happens every year when we're trying to make a budget and these massive debt burdens, these poor credit ratings that we have. So what Illinois Forward would do is say, the choice between slashing core services and always hiking taxes is a false choice. Those are not the only options. We can structurally reform our spending so that we spend money smarter rather than always just spending more. The biggest part of that proposal is pension reform. That also requires a constitutional amendment because of a very restrictive ruling from the Illinois Supreme Court that basically says you cannot change pensions. You can't do anything to fix them unless you amend your constitution. It was a ridiculous ruling, but we are where we are.
Yep.
And so that plan would protect every dollar that a retiree or a current worker has earned to date. So your current check would never get smaller. If you're a current worker not yet receiving a check, your core benefit wouldn't be reduced. But we would change the growth rate, things like the cost of living adjustment, to make them sustainable and affordable. The plan would save $2 billion per year over the next 10 years and more than $50 billion between now and 2045. And it would fully eliminate the pension debt without taking away anything anybody already has. We think it's a fair, reasonable, balanced solution. And unfortunately, in his budget address, the governor attacked this plan and said it's not a silver bullet and claimed it's a fantasy. And he relied on just wrong legal reasoning, just wrong, incorrect, not a matter of opinion, wrong legal reasoning to make that claim.
So what is his counter to that, right? Because if, he talks a big game, and he talked about the $1.8 billion and all of those things that he needs. But is that really enough to fix what's actually happening here?
His plan is not a serious plan. It's not. I mean, it's a fantasy. His plan is the fantasy. I mean, so you can just compare and contrast the plans. And I encourage anybody listening, pull up Illinois Forward on IllinoisPolicy.org.
Absolutely.
Go to the Governor's Office of Management Budget, pull up his budget. He wants to dedicate $100 million more to the pension system. That's about 1/6 of how much the pension payment's going to increase next year. So it's not even enough to tread water, much less make a dent. Mm-hmm. He wants to spend $50 million more on the bill backlog and paying down the state's unpaid bills. Our plan would dedicate $1.5 billion over the next and eliminate the bill backlog entirely over 4 years. So, he needs to get serious about, fixing the long-term problems, digging our way out of this hole, and it requires new thinking. I mean, politicians have been saying they balance the Illinois budget 19 years in a row. And 19 years in a row, the debt has grown and we've spent more than we brought in. And it's because they're not using realistic budgets.
Yeah, and I think that's also part of the problem is as you look at the gimmicks that are being used and things like that, the tricks or leaving certain things out and magically putting them back in later, do you really ever see or foresee the people in Springfield really going for this change and really doing something about it? Or is it a situation where realistically it might have to fail before it, hit rock bottom and we, the taxpayer, end up as the ultimate sufferer before they do anything?
Well, I'm an optimist. The governor called himself a relentless optimist in his speech and seemed to be implying that people who disagree with him are not. We both want the state to move forward in a better direction. We just have different views on the right way to do that. And we really think that we should be, deciding budgets based on math, not based on politics. Mm-hmm. And so, I would say that our plan actually, could get us out of this mess. It's true that Springfield politicians have so far been unwilling to address structural spending reform. And as a result of that, there are financial experts who disagree with me. There are those who say it's time for bankruptcy for Illinois. No state has ever declared bankruptcy. That would be a disaster. I mean, we want to avoid that outcome. The longer we wait, and if we let it get to, catastrophe levels like that, then the cuts we're going to have to see are going to be a lot worse. It's going to be bad for our economy, and it's going to take us longer to recover. We can do this proactively, and all three ideas in our plan in Illinois Forward have received bipartisan support, Democrats and Republicans, over the last 8 years or so. So they were popular at one point, and they need to be again if we're going to get serious about fixing Illinois' finances.
And along with that, do you think it takes the populace maybe writ large here, especially in the Chicago area, whether that's in the suburbs or in the city, to stop voting the same people into office if you want real change? Do you see people that are willing to work towards that type of a goal, or do you see people that are just so entrenched into how Illinois has worked that there really isn't a way for new thinking to really take hold in Springfield?
I think if we want to see real change, you're right that it starts with the people. I mean, they're the people who choose who goes down to Springfield, and they're the people who hold them accountable and, who they're supposed to be representing. So we need to make sure that residents of Illinois understand a few key facts. You cannot, the current pension promises, the current pension system cannot be preserved. It's a mathematical impossibility. So your choices are amend the Constitution now, do reform now, or, keep going with these accounting games, delay until it's a true catastrophe, until bankruptcy is the only option left. Pension reform is also the only real way to lower property taxes in this state. And so, once voters understand these kinds of things, I think we can apply the right pressure to Springfield. But I should say, the pension reform plan that we've suggested is modeled very closely off of a pension reform plan that passed in 2013 through a supermajority controlled Democratic House and Senate and was signed by a Democratic governor. Now, it had a lot of Republican support as well. But Democrats in the state, that was 7 years ago. Right. And since 2015, since that restrictive court ruling, they've kind of sat on their hands and, either pretended that there is no pension crisis or pretended that these sort of half measures and accounting games are going to be enough to fix it. And they're not.
Along those lines, I think one of the things that living here in Chicago, no matter how many people I talk to, it's always they understand that there's that corruption there. Do you feel like maybe there's a way forward with some way to amend the Constitution in this state to really enact the types of changes that need to happen? Is that a way forward that Illinois policy sees?
Yeah, we have to amend the Constitution. We have to amend the state constitution. It would require a 3/5 vote from the House and the Senate. It doesn't require the governor's signature. It requires the voters' approval. I think that voters want pension reform. I think that when you show people the math, they get it. They get that these inflated pensions cannot be sustained. And by trying to do so, we're actually putting the retirement security of our public servants at risk of bankruptcy, at risk of insolvency. So it's not good for anyone. And I really think, at this point, trying to defend the status quo on pensions itself is a form of corruption because it requires either, dangerous levels of ignorance or dishonesty from politicians. And anybody who's receiving a pension in Illinois, who's set to receive a pension in Illinois, who's being told that the current plan will make their retirement secure, is being, sold a bill of goods. So
definitely. In one of the encouraging things that I see when I talk to people here in the city is that Republican or Democrat, progressive or super conservative, everybody seems to agree that this is a local issue. This is something that I think crosses party divides. So if people want to get involved, how do they get involved in, enacting Illinois Forward or pressuring or really making their voice be heard to the people in Springfield? Because it feels like they do not want to listen.
Yeah, the first thing I would say, bookmark IllinoisPolicy.org, because we will keep you up to date on what's happening, what the solutions being proposed are, what they actually mean, because sometimes politicians, use marketing terms or confusing terms to kind of hide the ball on what they're really doing. So we break that down in understandable terms, what it means for you, what it means for your pocketbook, and what the alternatives are. And then lastly, I would say, if you're really interested in getting involved and being part of the solution, we have a Facebook group called the Lincoln Lobby, like Abraham Lincoln, the Lincoln Lobby. You can apply on Facebook, just search Lincoln Lobby. Let us know that you're coming from the Andrew Coppins Critical Thinking podcast. We'll try to get you fast tracked in because, we have about 15,000 members in that group already.
Absolutely.
And we've got a backlog of applications because we want to make sure that people are serious, about getting involved. But what we'll do is, give you some very quick, easy things you can do to make a difference. That's things like filing witness slips online, calling a lawmaker, sending an email, online petitions. A lot of it you can do from your computer or your phone at home. And so that's how we change the state.
All right. Again, you heard it. IllinoisPolicy.org is where you can find out all of that information. Thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you very much.
All right. Well, I hope you found that at least mildly interesting. I know not everybody is into Illinois politics and all of that, but it certainly is an interesting time with Blago and all the stuff going on and our fiscal house not being in order. But you know what else is not in order? Bail in the city of Chicago. Yes, that's right. Back in 2017, Cook County Chief Judge Timothy Evans decided they were going to tweak the bail bonds rules to make it quote unquote less about paying and more about risk. So the goal being that those that are in poverty should not be put in jail just because they're poor. Now, I would support that wholeheartedly because if all things are equal and the only thing that's different is somebody's ability to pay thousands of dollars versus hundreds of dollars, or nothing at all versus somebody who's a multimillionaire and can afford millions of dollars in bonds, I think that's a good goal. But it's how you execute that matters. And one of the things that I've been seeing personally in the past few years has been this increase in multiple crimes being committed by criminals while out on bail. And for me, it's been anecdotal, right? I see the things on the news or see things that are happening in my community and go, that doesn't make sense. Well, Reason.com has a study out, and guess what? They may not have had this rosy outcome indicated by Timothy Evans, okay? So according to him, the number of defendants who secured pretrial release between 2016 and 2018 jumped from 71.6 to 80.5%, nearly a 10% increase in the people who were let out on bail or released before their trials, okay? Cook County's jail population dropped from 7,443 to less than 6,000. So getting that population to decrease naturally would be a good thing. But last May, Evans released a report that showed releasing more defendants from jail did not put the community at greater risk of crime. According to the report, a high proportion of defendants, 83%, were charged with felonies and released under the new system, actually returning to court as ordered and did not commit new crimes while released. In all, Evans' report painted a positive picture that matched the narrative of those who support bail reform. That the court system in Cook County, according to Reason, were accurately sorting defendants based on the risk that they pose to public safety and their likelihood of showing up to trial, rather than simply leaving everybody in jail simply because they couldn't afford to pay what the courts ordered. Now, according to Reason again, the Chicago Tribune reports that Evans' report left out hundreds of violent crimes and charges filed after bail reforms were implemented. The reporters from the Chicago Tribune say that Evans did this by including certain violent crimes: murder, attempted murder, non-negligent, manslaughter, forcible rape, robbery, and aggravated battery, but excluding incidents like domestic violence, assault with a deadly weapon, battery, reckless homicide, and other type of violent crimes. So if Evans had reported all of those things, right, it turns out that the number of violent crimes committed by released defendants would have jumped from just 147 to 578. The largest chunk of these crimes, 231 of them, were for domestic battery. You mean to tell me that is not something that you would want people to be protected against? Evans' report, as Reason points out, would state that only 3 defendants who had been released under the new pretrial system had subsequently been charged with homicide. Okay, well, bad apples are bad apples and sometimes you can't get them all. But the Tribune actually identified 21 defendants accused of murder who had been released during the 15 months of bail reform the report reviewed. Their exclusion from Evans' report is supposedly a result of incomplete records and some odd reporting decisions, like only counting the first new charge a defendant received after being released. So, if you're following that at home, there was somebody put on pretrial release, arrested for another charge, released again, and then committed a third act, which was a homicide. Or they didn't count them because their initial charges weren't felonies. 5 murder defendants have been bonded out on misdemeanor charges. All this tells me is that it isn't working as well as you would hope it to have worked. You've done a good job in reducing the number of people that are going to jail, no question about that, and that can be a benefit to society. But what we've seen is that of that discrepancy, nearly a quarter of them have actually gone on to commit violent crimes here in the city of Chicago or within Cook County. That's not what this should be about. And then worse of all, I have seen personally multiple incidents where people have been bonded out and have committed multiple pettier crimes, multiple criminal offenses, and they continue to walk and walk and walk. In fact, there was somebody who's been arrested 143 times and is still not in jail, even after their last arrest for a violent crime. That's insane to me. That is an indication whether or not all 143 times resulted in conviction or not. You should be taking that into account when you're looking at protecting society. And that should be the ultimate goal here. And that is the problem with Evans and this entire situation, is that it's not about protecting the people. It's about protecting image and projecting criminal justice reform. So it turns out that in a separate review, Castle and Flows reanalyzed Evans' data and found other problems. So it turns out, when calculating the crime rate, Evans' report evaluated the before defendants for an average of 243 days and the after defendants for an average of just 154 days. So Castle and Fowles argue that this difference of nearly 100 days may well mean that in actuality, the post-reform crime rate among those released might be even higher than the number that we've already talked about. Castle and Fowles' report observes, quote, the second group will, other things being equal, undoubtedly commit fewer additional crimes simply because they've had less time to commit those crimes. When they actually correct for the time frame, Castle and Fowles estimate that there was actually a 45% increase in the number of new crimes caused by defendants who had been released. 45% increase? And I'm supposed to sit here and buy this as a positive for our society? It's absolutely insane. We've seen multiple muggings, multiple cases of beatings and horrific things happening by people who are released on bail. This system is not working. Will Cook County do anything about it? Of course not, because they want to be on the cutting edge of criminal justice reform. And if we just release people because they're poor, why don't you take a look at their criminal history and say, you know what? Sorry, no, you've got violent crimes, you've got felonies, you've got all of these things that add up. You are not getting out. It should be real simple to get this reform done. There should be reform. But the way that it's being done, no. Why, no. On that note, it is time for us to say auf Wiedersehen, tschüss, goodbye for this week on Critical Thinking. Thank you so much for tuning in. Don't forget you can follow me at The Coppins Show, youtube.com/Andrew Coppins, youtube.com/Andrew Coppins for more of Critical Thinking. All right, well, coming up next is Matthew Holloway and the HollowNet program here on Mojo 50 Radio, my millennial brother from another mother. So keep it locked, loaded, tuned in here on Mojo 50 Radio. Until next week, keep being smart, keep being safe. Do not forget Matthew 5:44.